Okay, let's do it. Thanks everyone for joining our November issue of the webinar series. Today we're talking about the top 10 reasons projects fail and how to overcome these challenges. So we appreciate your attendance. We do record this and we'll be able to send it out to you afterwards, so you'll have the resources along with a few other things that you might be interested in. Just some updates on the academic side of CSS. Coming up in spring, we do have some new cohorts starting for some of our STENDR programs, Masters in Healthcare Administration, MBA, and also a project management certificate that we're now running in all terms at CSS. I'm going to flash to the next slide there.
There you go.
Some background about CSS for those who don't know. Some of you are familiar with Scholastica, some very familiar. But the college was founded over 100 years ago. Benedictine Catholic school, don't have to be Catholic necessarily to attend CSS. We have student backgrounds, religions, and cultures. The one thing we do take from the Catholic world that we do infuse into what we do is what's called the Benedictine values: community, hospitality, respect, stewardship, and a love of learning. These are values that are just kind of humanistic values that we do hold very dear, and we do work to infuse into everything that we do. And I say that as an employee and as a former student perspective. So that's how we operate. Again, the project management program, we're excited to be offering it in every term. So 6 starts a year. So over the next couple months, with the holidays approaching, if you're having conversations with friends and family around the dinner table or wherever you're at, feel free to just bring up, interject. Hey, does anyone have an idea of how they want to bolster their resume this coming year? Maybe a certificate's a good way to start. Feel free to spread that word and let people know about what we do at CSS. We do rely heavily on word of mouth and referrals from our friends and connections to the college. So Brandon, were you going to chat a bit about the program details?
Yes, I can do that. So hi, I'm Brandon Olson. I'm a professor at the College of St. Scholastica and graduate program director for our Master of Science in Applied Data Analytics and our graduate certificate in project management. And today's topic is a project management related topic. So just reminding you that we do have a certificate in project management, 4 courses, finish that up in 2 semesters. And our next cohort is starting in January. Just a little bit about that. And you can contact us if you want more information about that. Next slide. All right, and today our guest speaker here is Kent Lacy. Kent holds a doctorate of education degree in organization development and has been certified as a project management professional since 2000. He has over 30 years of industry experience working in management and project management roles. In addition to his industry experience, Kent has been working as an adjunct instructor in higher education for the past 20 years. He's currently serving as an adjunct instructor here at the College of St. Scholastica, where he teaches in the project management program on the topics ranging from core to advanced project management principles. So without further ado, Kent, you want to continue?
All right. Thank you, Brandon. Thanks, everyone. And thank you for joining today. So today we're talking about these top 10 reasons project fail. And, when I was prepping for the presentation, I kind of thought, well, gosh, there's a lot of reasons. I did some research, and there's definitely more than 10 reasons why projects fail. What I tried to do is to identify the reasons for failure that need to be addressed earlier, that aren't like precursor problems or subsequent problems as a result of not being prepared. For example, poor communications could lead to poor quality overall, and you'll see that in the presentation overall. I identified these 10. They're listed in alphabetical order, so it's not any kind of rank order there. And we're going to talk about communications and the impact communications has on project success. Another one that's kind of interesting is this concept of project culture. And so when we think about it from an organization perspective, we have an organizational culture, but what's the culture of project work that's done within organizations? Talk about that. Unrealistic deadlines is something we deal with all the time. Really, those are often driven by unrealistic or unreliable estimates. Lack of effective leadership is something that definitely can impact a project in a negative manner. Planning is key in project management overall, and so poor or lack of planning, based on my experience, typically projects do make an effort to do some type of planning, and so it would be pretty unusual that a project didn't do any planning at all. But sometimes I hear from students that are doing things on the side that's an issue. Misunderstood project purpose or need, lack of effective risk management, the dreaded scope creep, which is something that we deal with often, and finally, inadequate stakeholder management. So we're going to cover those one by one. The slides are set up in a similar manner. Once we get through all the 10 points, we will end the presentation with any questions or discussion. And if anything comes up during the presentation, please raise your hand or put something in the chat. Looks like there's something there now. Brandon, were you going to monitor that chat? Looks like Joe was posted something. Okay. Yeah, you're on mute, Brandon.
Yeah, Joe posted a reminder about our graduate programs. That's all.
Oh, okay. All right. Okay, let's get to the first one, poor communications. So from a communication perspective, we can run into a situation where people feel isolated. They don't feel like part of the project. They might be requested to participate in the effort, but if we're not communicating with that, we're going to some conflict, work conflict being one, that feeling of isolation. What are they really asking me to do would be another impact. Clearly, if we don't communicate, we're probably going to have some misunderstandings, and oftentimes those lead to disagreements. An example of that would be a misunderstanding related to scope that could lead to a disagreement, really, a scope disagreement. Or I was just in a meeting earlier today, and we were talking about, we were doing a go, no go for some installs that we're doing this weekend. And there were some misunderstandings about how testing was completed. And as a result of that, the conversation led to the identification that there were a couple defects that had been deferred, which is fine, but there was disagreement with people on the line. And really that was due to poor communications. We had our product owner for this install was out last week, and so we didn't have enough time to prepare the communication as we would normally do. Or another impact is incorrect or uncoordinated task delivery. As you know, within projects, oftentimes there's a hierarchy of tasks that's completed. And if we don't communicate those task assignments and what the predecessors are or dependencies are, we're going to end up getting things delivered in a fashion that I would call willy-nilly, which is not a technical term. It's like people just delivering whenever they can. And obviously that's not very helpful. So how do we resolve this? Creating a communications plan, and you're going to see that. I don't lay it on everything, but a communications plan outlines who are the stakeholders, what's their interest in the project, and what are their communication preferences. And oftentimes we get into some demographics with, what's their phone number, address, things like that. But the plan outlines how are we going to communicate with the stakeholders involved in our project. And it's very important to create it and then to maintain it as the project's being executed. From a communication perspective, and we talked about stakeholders before in a previous session, but we need to engage stakeholders in the project effort. We can't expect our stakeholders to absorb the change without understanding what it's about. And so communication really establishes that understanding. And as project managers, we always need to look at when we're collecting information related to our projects. Let's listen more than talk, and let's be active listeners in capturing those communication preferences and possibly some issues associated with the project overall. If we get these things in place, especially that communication plan, and then we get those stakeholders engaged, meaning they're being communicated, they're participating in the effort, we'll be a lot better off from a communication perspective. One final thing here, it's often mentioned that it's pretty hard in project management to over communicate. And I would agree with that to a certain degree or a certain perspective, but we want to focus our communications on the stakeholder groups and what are the things they're interested in looking at and being aware of, rather than just overloading them with a bunch of communication that doesn't apply to them. And what happens with that, as you can imagine, is once people get accustomed to getting that overload of information, they tend to not pay attention to it, right? It's kind of overwhelming, and they don't pay attention like they probably would if we had more focused communications overall. So communications very important and something that we need to focus on. I would say in my work, I probably spend a focus of 75 to 80% of my day just in communicating with people, either in written format or in meetings or things like that. And that's normal, right? So communications is definitely a big part of project management. A weak project culture, I found this is kind of interesting, and think about it. So what's the culture within the organization and how they execute projects, right? Is there a culture overall? And impacts of this are clearly poorly executed projects. I've run into this problem often when we don't have a strong project focused culture. We get resources assigned to a project because they're required, but oftentimes other work trumps the project work, we'll say, right? And so inadequate resource assignments, gosh, you're a project manager, you're working on a particular deliverable, and you need resources clearly to get that work done. If those resources continually get pulled off your project to do some other things, we're not going to meet our deadlines, and it's going to have a negative impact to the project overall. So that's the resource assignment part of this. Some organizations have, I would say, an inadequate, or they might not have any type of project delivery processes. I think it's pretty unusual these days for an organization to have no project delivery process, but it might not be clearly defined. People might not be trained in it. And here's a key part: people might not be following it, right? And so when that weak culture, if we have a process, but it's not being followed, that's really an attribute of that weak project culture. By having the weak project cultures, well, we're going to probably end up having poor communications overall in the project itself, because the messages just aren't getting out to the stakeholder groups as they need to. And finally, inappropriate decision making based on incomplete information. Okay. So how do we resolve this weak project culture issue? We want to develop and align our project delivery processes. So we want to make sure that they're in place. And let me give you another word for processes. We use the word methodology a lot. We've kind of gotten away from that a little bit, at least in the organization that I work for. And what we used to call project management methodology is now called a change delivery process. Same thing, nothing changed, but we're just calling it something different. So we want to make sure those processes are in place. and people know what they are, and we want to make sure that they're being followed. That's the key thing. I've been in many organizations where they run into trouble with adherence to their process or to their methodology, and obviously that's going to have a negative impact on a project overall. We want to create this culture, project culture, with a shared system of shared principles and patterns. From a methodology or delivery perspective, there's a beginning and an end, right, in a project. And those patterns in beginning and an end are going to vary. I have a graphic here in a minute, but the patterns are going to change a little bit to get from point A to point B, but the principles they're based upon don't change. And so making sure that people are aware of those principles and why we're doing it and what those patterns are for certain aspects of project management. Planning, for example, would be one. Another pattern that I deal with a lot is user acceptance testing and then ultimately implementation. And we're working on several implementations coming up this weekend. We want to measure and report on progress. And the reason for that is it's going to be an indication of how's the project culture doing overall. Are we tracking according to plan? Are we ahead? Are we behind? We want to make sure that we keep a pulse on the project. And by measuring and tracking our progress, we get an idea of how's the project culture coming together overall, if it was weak in the first place. The last resolution is to develop an implementation project management job family. So it's pretty hard within an organization. I'm taking us back, like in my experience 30 years ago, there weren't project management job titles or job families. Those have developed as the industry has matured, and most organizations today have those project management job families. But you can imagine if those aren't in place or people aren't being called project managers, we're going to have a corresponding impact to that whole idea of, well, what's our project culture overall when we're not really even talking about project management from a roles and responsibilities perspective. All right. Next one here is unrealistic deadlines. I can't tell you how often a project comes to me with a deadline. It's not supposed to work that way, right? And so the impact of not having realistic deadlines are, it's going to be a high pressure working environment. Oftentimes what happens is as we progress through the work required to complete the project, things kind of get pushed down the road, and whatever tasks and activities are at the end of the life cycle end up being very cut short on time and results in a lot of high pressure working. And obviously that can lead to turnover that no organizations within this current project management environment can deal with or can afford to lose people. Hey, you work in a high pressure environment, you could have a corresponding low morale overall, right? And morale is going to impact project quality. That's the fourth item on the list here. And also is going to possibly increase that turnover of project managers or people working within the field within the organization. Sometimes people take different roles within the same organization to get away from the high pressure working environment. The last impact thing here that I wanted to mention is we need an alignment of scope to cost. And there's a thing in project management, many of you are aware of the triple constraint, right? Scope, schedule, and cost, right? Well, if we have a schedule that's unrealistic, we're going to have to look at scope and cost in order to meet the schedule. Oftentimes, that means we end up cutting back or whittling away a little bit at the scope and delivering the minimum required deliverables. And it could have a corresponding impact to cost depending on how your costs or your projects are paid for. So to resolve this, we really need to look at what's our motivation for the deadlines. And I mentioned, you know, oftentimes projects come my way with the deadline, and some of those could be regulatory things, and it's not the organization's fault, right? There's regulatory requirements that come with the deadline, and it's easy to understand the motivation for that. However, there are some other circumstances where deadlines aren't clearly understood, or it's not really clear why they were established in the first place. So understanding that, when we look at the deadlines, we're going to look at scope and say, okay, what's the priority of the scope or the deliverables as a part of the project? And we definitely, when we have what we would consider an unrealistic deadline, we definitely need to manage scope, right? Because there can't be any additions to scope during the project life cycle and still meet the deadline overall. All right. Next principle. I like this little graphic here of all the arrows miss the target. Okay. Unreliable estimates. All right. So I work in a lot of technology projects, and we have a lot of cascading impacts within our technology area or within the technology projects. And so when we, in the past, when we would have a new project effort come up, there was an estimation process where some sort of documentation would be developed, hopefully a full requirements document. But to be honest, that was pretty rare to happen. But some sort of scope statement goes out to these estimating parties, and they come out with an overall estimation for that portion of the scope that they're responsible for. What I found is when that documentation is pretty brief, right? Or when the requirements aren't fully defined, we're going to end up having those estimators pad their estimates. So they're going to go on the high end of their estimate. And that's clearly going to have an impact to the project overall. If estimates are accepted as is, they're taken for granted, and an impact could be estimations or expectations are met because the date wasn't met. There could be an impact that business value was lost or limited because our estimates were too large, and estimated to take too long of a period of time. And so we could whittle away at that overall business value unnecessarily. An impact definitely project managers are deal with, and we're going to talk about that and some of the other causes of failure. But a result could be poor or weak credibility. And so what, right? So you're a project manager and maybe the estimate wasn't very well developed for your project. Believe it or not, and you probably would believe it, that's going to carry on with you in your future work, right? And so people are going to remember, oh gosh, Kent had that project that just had crazy estimates that weren't realistic at all, right? And we've had situations like this in the past, and that credibility is super important for you as an individual. It's also super important for project management overall as an organization function. The other thing is, and this is logical, right? If we have unreliable estimates, we're going to probably have to request for extensions, or we're going to have disruptions to the project itself. I've been in situations where estimates come in early to a project based on, remember, maybe a scope statement only. We get into the project and we find out it's going to be much more involved than we expected, and rework needs to be done. That's that disruption part. So how do we resolve or address this potential cause of project failure? We want to implement estimation SMEs, that's SME, subject matter experts, and process. So we don't want to have an ad hoc estimation process. We don't want it to go to people that don't know what's involved and the importance of an estimate. We want to train people in how to estimate, and we want to put a process together where it's not done in a silo. Okay, we go out to our impacted parties, we get their estimates, and then we have a process in place to review and accept the estimates with the key project stakeholders and sponsor group. One thing that we've done due to these estimates, and it happens all the time, somebody has an idea, they want to get an idea of what it's going to take to make it happen, and they only have that short scope statement I mentioned, right? So we want to implement what I call multi-point estimation processes. And the key thing here is let's re-estimate. That's the third point here. Let's re-estimate this thing once we know more, right? So our estimate could be, from an accuracy perspective, plus or minus 50% if all we're getting is a scope statement. Once we have project requirements defined at that key milestone, we can re-estimate, and we're going to lower that plus or minus factor associated with the estimate to lower. And what we've used is 10 to 15% once requirements are done. And once design is done, then we're saying about plus or minus 5%. It's always funny, you always say plus or minus, but honestly, I don't know how often we come minus. It's always plus, right? We're always taking longer than we would expect. Okay. We finally want to increase and communicate estimation accuracy based on the project status. So we want to say, here's where we are from a project status perspective. Here are our estimates, and are they off or are they online, right? And so this ties with the communication principle. Okay. All right, let me do a time check. All right, we're half through here, doing pretty good. So effective leadership. So leadership is really from a couple perspectives. Obviously, a project manager is a leader. Also, project sponsors play a key leadership role in the effort overall. And we want to make sure that persons in those roles are effective. Impact of those are poor reputation. And like I said before, well, you might not care so much about reputation from an individual perspective, but you should, okay? Also, reputation from a project delivery perspective is super important. If we have a reputation of not delivering on what we promised we would do, people are going to quit participating, right? We're going to have those stakeholders that we've designated as persons that are very aware of current processes and requirements. And if we have a poor reputation, it's going to be hard to get those persons actively participating because they'll feel like, well, it's just a waste of time. We're going to have cost overruns because of that lack of communication and understanding. That goes also with schedule delays. And when we're talking about ineffective leadership, that has a direct correlation to project team motivation, right? And we're going to have an impact to motivation overall across the project team. I would say that's going to carry on to your stakeholder group too. And overall, the impact is underperformance. So we're not really delivering on and performing like we said we would. So how do we resolve this? So from a project management perspective, we want to make sure we implement training programs for project managers. And most people in a project manager role are very familiar with training, and it's typically ongoing. Things change all the time. Processes get updated. Project managers are continually asked to go back and do additional training. A key thing, and I included sponsors here because I feel like a lot of sponsors go into the role and they're not really aware of what's expected to them or what their responsibilities are. And so training for sponsors is super important. One way to address this is to implement a project management mentoring program. And we've done that before in the past where we have, like any other organization, senior and more junior project managers. We have people that maybe come into the field as project coordinators, and we have mentoring processes in place to help coach and train them into becoming full-blown project managers. And that's all done through these mentoring relationships where we pair people up, and it's gone pretty well overall. I would say one thing for sure, if you ever have been involved in a mentoring relationship before in the past, make sure it's understood, what the expectations are with or in the relationship itself, and make sure that both the mentee and the mentor are dedicated and interested in continuing in that type of role. So oftentimes what organizations do when they have maybe more immaturity in their knowledge base is they hire people for their expertise. Like, it's logical, right? And so we hire people with experience in project management, bring them in, and they can serve as those mentors. They can also serve as those persons to recommend specific training programs. And finally, implement assessment programs, leadership assessment programs, right? So we have people in place, we have people assigned as project managers and project sponsors. How are they doing, and what are some things that they might do differently? What are some things that they shouldn't be doing, which is key also. So implementing those assessment programs, tying that back to the mentoring or coaching programs that you have is a key activity for that to resolve your lack of effective leadership. Planning. So this is obviously super important, right? When we look at the Project Management Institute's process groups, we start with initiation. Project is initiated. Right after initiation, it's all about planning. We have a whole process group focused on planning, and it's not something to be shortcut. Also, though, it's not something to belabor over and get stuck in that analysis paralysis that happens. This is that diagram that I mentioned earlier. I've seen a lot of teams have this expectation where they're going to be able to plan everything from start to finish, and it's going to be a straight line, right? And we won't have any deviations to plans. This absolutely never happens. Here's what happens. We start, we get a little bit of deviation, we make some corrections, maybe we overcorrect, and we go in this path. We get to finish, but the path isn't a straight line, and that is the reality of project management. For us to spend so much time in planning that we won't have any deviation and we're not going to have any changes to scope is just not realistic. And be mindful of that. You could end up having some sponsors that want to take this straight line start to finish approach. Be mindful of that and be careful about how you communicate with them about the process overall. So what are the impacts of poor planning, weak understanding of objectives overall, right? I mean, if we don't start with some basis of strong project objectives, we're going to definitely run into some problems. And what are those? Well, we're going to probably have cost overruns, schedule delays. And remember, we got back to this trust or reliability, or what was the term I used before? Reputation. Yep. So you can end up, if we don't plan enough, people are going to remember. And they're honestly, I'm sure you have experiences sometimes too in your careers where you're asked to participate in something and you think about like, oh man, we're doing this again, right? How many times have I been asked to do that same thing? Over time, the credibility isn't there and the trust just isn't there. So spend your time planning and focus on those activities. Don't get mired up into trying to do too many things at one time, like starting execution, for example. What's the overall impact? Also, cost impacts, schedule impacts, quality impacts, definitely. Okay. Whoops. So how do we resolve this one? Well, we need to dedicate appropriate time for planning. I was looking to include some stats to share with you about, well, how much time is essentially dedicated on average to planning, and it really varies. I didn't find anything super definitive, so I didn't include it in here. But the idea here is let's dedicate the appropriate time for planning. Let's come up with a plan for a plan, so to speak, and execute on it. All right. The next thing is this, let go of this all or nothing mentality, this straight line expective, meaning we're going to define this project to the nth degree. And once we get done with our planning, everything will go smoothly. Planning is great. There's a lot of things that happen during execution that can impact your plans, from being a straight line start to finish to being this reality plan or path. So don't focus too deep on getting things defined to the nth degree. One approach that I typically take is let's feel comfortable with the plan, at least from an 80% perspective, right? So we feel 80% confident, and 20% is probably what you're going to deal with as we get into execution, as we get into testing, training, communications, things like that. Okay, so don't get hung up on this. I've dealt with sponsors like this before in the past, and it's really kind of a careful line. You don't want to offend any sponsor, but it's a careful line to coach them into getting away from the all or nothing mentality. Hey, when we start our planning, we should start saying, okay, well, what's the goals and objective of the project and who is impacted? That's our stakeholders, right? So we need to identify those stakeholders. Those are the people that will be involved, that will communicate to, that will likely be involved in the execution activities. And definitely our stakeholders are set up as those persons that are going to inherit your end deliverables. Okay. We want to define those roles and responsibilities and make it clear who's responsible for what. Oftentimes we do this through a diagram. We call it a Lacy diagram: responsible, accountable, informed, and consulted. Lacy. And people are identified by role in the project or in the Lacy diagram, and that designation of responsible, accountable, informed, or consulted, sorry, are included in the Lacy, and everybody should be clear on what they're doing. If they're not, it's the Lacy diagram is, let me just type in Lacy here. The Lacy diagram, that's how it's spelled, helps to clarify those key points in responsibilities that need to be allocated out, we'll say. The other thing from a planning perspective is, remember I said 80-20, right? Let's plan to 80%. Let's deal with the 20% because it's probably going to come up via change, and a process to identify that and to identify those additional 20% of our plans typically comes out of these milestone reviews. So we do milestone reviews at the end of key points within the project life cycle. And that's when we talk through and clarify certain things that weren't 100% locked down in our planning activities. So plan for change is essentially what that's telling us here, okay? All right, so misunderstood, remember these are in alphabetical order, so no priority, all right? So we need to understand and we need to clearly define the purpose or need for the project. If it's not there, how are we going to possibly determine if we've been successful in the project overall? Impact is lack of clarity. Clearly, organizational alignment refers to project work is typically driven by strategic planning activities, right? And so we need to be aligned. Our strategic plans, or rather our projects, need to align to our strategic plans or priorities. And on the other side, once projects are delivered, those project work needs to be incorporated in to ongoing organizational change management activities. Operations, essentially, once projects end, they move into operations. If we don't understand the purpose or need for a project, we're going to lose that ability to control the scope and the accountability, right? So you're going to end up, if we go into a project and the scope hasn't been very well defined, you're going to end up probably with some pretty significant change or scope creep. Scope creep's coming up here on the list here pretty soon. Clearly, we're going to lose productivity in doing that spin, right, of trying to actually figure out what the purpose or need is for this. And here we go with quality again, right? So if we don't know what we're delivering and what the purpose or need for it is, how are we going to possibly deliver a quality product? Super important, and clearly has an impact to project success or failure. From a resolution perspective here, hey, we want to start with clear requirement statements. We want to engage sponsors and senior leaders to establish that project purpose, and that really should be established in the initiation process group for a project. We need to engage our stakeholders to establish this process, right? Or purpose. Think about it. Stakeholders are going to end up with the end deliverable. They're going to be responsible for that work once the project ends and is handed over to operations. So we need to engage with them about, okay, what is the purpose for this project and what are the requirements that need to be in place? And I've seen oftentimes where we just listen to this group, the sponsor and senior leaders, and don't listen to the people that are going to be impacted on a day-to-day basis. Those people that are impacted on a day-to-day basis are the people you definitely need to connect with, because you're going to be changing their work process and their lives. And so being aware of what we're doing and why definitely needs to be aligned with stakeholder needs. And then finally, let's implement some review structures. Remember, we talked about those milestone reviews. So we can implement the review structures as part of our milestone review to make sure that we're staying on track with that purpose and need. And we're making sure that our end deliverables are being built to align with the purpose and need, just align with the purpose and need. So one thing we see in project management from time to time is what we call gold plating, or things get added to scope because it seems like, well, this would be nice to have once you get into it. And this might be a feature that would help here or there. If it's not a specific project requirement, an idea needs to be brought back to the team to determine if it needs to be added as a project. And with that, we're going to have some scope or change approvals that'll have to be done. The reason why we don't want to add, good ideas, and a lot of times these are great ideas, to scope is because it introduces more risk to the project down the line. If we've defined what our requirements are and what the purpose for the project is, we don't want to add things to it that might break when we're actually in and testing the final product overall, or even worse, when it gets into a production or ongoing operations perspective. So we want to make sure that we implement these review structures, make sure that we're staying on track and that we haven't added anything from an unknown perspective. Sometimes these things that get added, this stuff comes out actually in our testing activities, which is way down the line and too late in the project life cycle. All right, 3 more. We got about 10 minutes left here. So we need to have an effective approach toward risk management. Clearly, there's some impacts. If we don't manage risk, we're going to have delays. We're going to overrun our costs. We're going to have unhappy stakeholders. And here we go with reputation again, right? So we need to manage risk. It's an ongoing activity. As project management as an organizational function has matured over the years, we've definitely seen more focus on risk management. And in years past, risk management would be something that often was taken on at the beginning of a project during the planning process group and possibly not revisited again until the project is over, which clearly is not what we want to do. We want to have that culture of risk, right? And we want to make sure that we incorporate risk management into our ongoing activities and risk awareness too. So how do we resolve this? So we're going to do some planning. We're going to create a risk management plan. Typically, that's a plan that defines how we're going to manage risk, how are we going to track risks, who's involved, and when are we going to meet, and things like that. When are we going to have these milestone reviews? So we got a plan and structure in place. We need to then also incorporate this risk thinking into our project delivery processes from beginning to end, right? There's some risks at the beginning of a project that maybe might only exist during the execution or during the initiation and planning process groups. And then they no longer, then they're resolved, right? There could be, and there definitely will be, I should say it like that, definitely will be new risks that come up during the project life cycle. That's why we want to be continuous with this, right? We want to develop and implement risk management strategies that actually work. And we implement a strategy and track it to resolution. And again, these milestone reviews, we want to conduct regular risk reviews. And to me, milestone reviews are great. They're less frequent than ongoing communications and project status meetings. I've incorporated and found it effective to dedicate time to those more frequent meetings rather than the less frequent meetings. And let's talk about risk during our project status meetings. And so we always have a portion of the agenda that outlines our outstanding risks and what the status is, so people are aware of it. And oftentimes, as we progress through the project lifecycle, oftentimes ideas and things come up that will implement or will impact, rather, our mitigation strategies. So the regular risk reviews is definitely a way to help prevent getting off track and having project problems. Scope creep, hey, probably not a big surprise. And, communications and scope are definitely causes of project failure. if we looked at these from a frequency perspective, this would be right up there, probably in the top 1 or 2. And so scope creep is, as most of you are aware, we have requirements and changes have been identified, but not, I would say, not accepted and logged through the project lifecycle. So what happens is, as project managers, we're being held to not only what the original requirements were, but anything else that got added, we're required for those corresponding budget overruns and schedule delays and possibly missed deadlines, right? So we want to be sure to keep a tight control on scope. The thing that's cool about this, though, from a project management perspective, is that, hey, change, I tell people, send me your changes. I expect change, and every project management should expect change throughout the life cycle. So we're not going to limit change, but what's cool about it for a project manager is, okay, changes come our way, we log it and we review it, but we're not the decision makers. It's the responsibility of the sponsors and the stakeholders to accept a change, okay? And part of that acceptance is any budget or financial impacts and any schedule impacts, right? So let's follow a process. We log change, we review it, we either approve or unapprove it, and we update our schedule and budget in a corresponding fashion. And when anything comes back or we miss a deadline or something like that, we can always go back to our change log and identify that, hey, this is the reason why our original schedule changed, or this is why our budget changed, and we'll have that information about what the specific impacts were and who approved it, okay? So I already mentioned this. So when we gold plate, I mentioned that term before, or we add things to scope that haven't been approved, we're adding or we're increasing uncertainty, right? So we're adding risk to the project. If it's something that was added that maybe seemed like a nice to have, and I was a programmer for a number of years, and I know that these things come up and it seems like, well, I'm building a quality product, but if it wasn't defined to do that, then you're adding risk that could be realized in the project either during test activities and cause rework, or even worse, there could be an issue that's built into a product that's ultimately delivered and not discovered until it gets into ongoing use or into operations, which are, as we know, the most expensive form of change that we can experience in a project. Something we definitely want to avoid. Impact, clearly quality is going to come up here. We're going to have some issues with that. And if we experience a lot of scope creep, we're going to end up with a situation where, hey, we got resources assigned based on what we knew the scope was, right? In planning, we didn't want any change, and all of a sudden our resources say they don't have enough time to get the work done as defined. Super important. And we, with change comes possibly additional resources that need to be added. I found this graphic. I don't know if you all have seen this, but I thought this was kind of cool about the scope creep monster there. So, so what do we want to do to resolve it? We're going to create that scope management plan. A lot of planning, right? A lot of documentation, but it defines how are we going to do it for this project. And oftentimes we start those plans with something that we had built before in the past, and then we control processes, and we want to verify scope with the stakeholders. Super important. Last impact is stakeholder management. If we don't manage our stakeholders, we're going to end up having schedule delays and higher costs. We're going to have frustration on their part and negative publicity, right? Reputation also. Conflicting views of project objectives. people aren't going to support the project overall. And as a result, we're going to have increased risks.
Hey, Ken, can you share your PowerPoint again? That had gone away.
Oh, did it? Oh, gosh. Okay. Having a hard time figuring out where I am. There I am. Okay. Right here. Okay. Did that come back?
Perfect.
Okay. All right, good. Okay. How do we resolve this? Well, hey, let's engage your stakeholders. That's a great idea, right? We're going to do some planning. We're going to identify who these stakeholders are, what their interest in the project is, and what their influence is. That's going to drive a lot for us to be able to interact with them. We want to be transparent in our project. Where's it at? Honestly, from a project delivery perspective, and we want to build those targeted communications to our stakeholder groups. We want to set expectations and then engage stakeholders in the project effort overall. So with that, we're right at the top of the hour. 1 minute for questions and discussion. Sorry for the delay there, everyone. Anything come to mind that you have questions about?